In the spring of 1865, the war that had torn a nation apart finally fell silent. For millions of Black Americans, the end of the Civil War did not simply mark peace, it marked a beginning. Chains were gone. Families once sold apart reached for one another again. Roads that had carried slave coffles now carried free men and women walking with purpose, hope, and dignity. Freedom meant more than survival. It meant education for their children, land of their own, legal marriages, Sophia, churches without fear, and above all, a voice in the future through the ballot. But that hope was fragile. Almost as soon as freedom was claimed, it was challenged. As Black communities built schools, registered to vote, and stepped into public life, a violent backlash took shape. Night riders moved in silence. Threats replaced laws. Fear became a weapon. Reconstruction, meant to rebuild the nation on equal ground, was met with organized resistance, determined to erase Black progress before it could take root. What followed was not chaos, but strategy. Terror was used to control elections. Violence was timed to silence voices. Entire communities were pushed to choose between safety and citizenship. This is a chapter of American history that is often simplified or ignored altogether, but its truth is far more powerful. Because this is not only a story of oppression, it is a story of courage. It is the story of Black men who had fought for the Union returning home and refusing to surrender the freedom they had earned. Men who stood guard over churches, escorted voters to polling places, and faced terror with discipline and resolve. Their actions would shake the foundations of white supremacist power and force the federal government to act. If stories of hidden history, resilience, and justice matter to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring these overlooked stories into the light. Now, let us begin the story they did not want remembered. The promise of freedom described at the war's end did not fade by accident. It was challenged deliberately, methodically, and with chilling intent. As Black communities began to organize schools, claim wages, attend political meetings, and step toward the ballot box, a shadow movement formed to halt that progress before it could reshape the South. This was not a spontaneous wave of anger or isolated acts of hostility. It was coordination. It was planning. And it was built on the belief that Black citizenship itself had to be destroyed in order for the old hierarchy to survive. In towns still bearing the scars of war, the Ku Klux Klan took shape behind closed doors and whispered oaths. Former Confederate officers, local elites, and men who refused to accept defeat reorganized themselves into a force that operated at night and vanished by dawn. Their goal was simple but ruthless: to make participation in public life so dangerous for Black Americans that freedom would become unbearable. Violence was not random. It followed calendars, elections, and moments of Black advancement. When voter registration drives began, threats multiplied. Thrice the early. When schools opened, teachers were warned. When churches became centers of civic life, they became targets of fear. The strength of the Klan did not lie only in the men who rode under cover of darkness, but in the silence that surrounded them. In many counties, those tasked with enforcing the law were either sympathetic or complicit, allowing intimidation to replace justice. This gave the illusion that the terror was unstoppable, that resistance was futile, and that the old order would always reassert itself. Masks and robes were not simply costumes. They were tools designed to project inevitability, to suggest that the violence came not from neighbors, but from something untouchable and omnipresent. For Black families, the danger was constant and exhausting. Nightfall became a moment of dread. Ordinary acts, attending a meeting, teaching a child to read, speaking one's mind, carried unseen risks. Yet the most dangerous act of all was voting. The ballot represented everything the Klan feared: autonomy, representation, and the collapse of a racial system that had defined the South for generations. To suppress it, terror had to be visible, memorable, and repeated until fear did the work of law. And yet, the strategy was built on a fatal miscalculation. The Klan assumed that intimidation alone would force submission, that Black Americans would retreat into silence once violence escalated. What they failed to understand was that many of those they sought to silence had already faced death on battlefields and survived. They had worn uniforms, followed commands, and learned discipline under fire. When they returned home and saw their communities threatened, they recognized the pattern not as chaos, but as an enemy campaign. The same organization that relied on secrecy and fear now faced something it had not anticipated, resistance rooted in resolve rather than rage. Black veterans began to stand watch, to organize patrols, and to defend the spaces where freedom was being built. Their presence disrupted the Klan's carefully crafted image of dominance. Where terror depended on invisibility, resistance brought visibility. Where fear relied on isolation, defense created solidarity. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not erase danger. But it fractured the illusion that white supremacist violence was unstoppable. Each protected meeting, each escorted voter, and each guarded school weakened the Klan's power by exposing it as something that could be confronted rather than endured. The struggle moved from the shadows into the open, where its outcome would no longer be decided by fear alone, but by law, organization, and the determination of those who refused to surrender the meaning of freedom they had only just begun to claim. While the violence of night riders haunted the roads and fields, a quieter but equally dangerous assault on freedom unfolded in daylight. If terror was the weapon of fear, the law became the weapon of control. Across the former Confederate states, lawmakers moved swiftly to redefine freedom on their own terms, crafting a web of legislation known as the Black Codes. On paper, these laws claimed to restore order in a society emerging from war. In practice, they were designed to bind black life so tightly that emancipation would exist in name only. The codes appeared in state after state with striking similarity, as if written from the same blueprint. Freedom, they declared, did not include the right to move freely, choose one's work, or stand as an equal before the courts. Black men and women were required to carry proof of employment, and those who could not present it risked arrest for vagrancy. Work contracts were not agreements between equals, but instruments of coercion, often forcing laborers into long hours, low pay, and harsh conditions with no realistic path of escape. Breaking a contract, even under abuse, could lead to fines, imprisonment, or forced labor that eerily resembled the system slavery had supposedly replaced. Property. Ownership, the cornerstone of independence, was narrowed or blocked altogether. In many regions, black families found themselves barred from buying land in desirable areas or hemmed into marginal spaces where opportunity was scarce. Without land or capital, economic self-sufficiency remained out of reach, keeping entire communities dependent on white employers who now wielded the law as leverage. Even family life, so recently reclaimed, was placed under scrutiny. Movement after dark, gatherings without permission, and travel beyond certain boundaries could invite punishment, reinforcing the idea that black freedom existed only under constant supervision. Perhaps most devastating was the way the Black Codes hollowed out justice itself. In courtrooms across the South, black testimony was often restricted or dismissed, especially in cases involving white defendants. This imbalance ensured that abuse could occur without consequence and that legal recourse remained largely symbolic. The message was unmistakable. Protection under the law was conditional, uneven, and easily withdrawn. While the codes avoided the language of ownership, they preserved its logic, transferring control from plantations to courtrooms and police stations. These laws did not operate in isolation. They worked in tandem with the terror already stalking black communities. Where intimidation silenced resistance at night, the codes constrained it by day, creating a cycle in which fear and legality reinforced one another. A man threatened for attempting to vote might find himself arrested weeks later for violating a labor rule. A teacher driven from town by threats could be fined or jailed for lacking proper authorization. Violence enforced the laws, and the laws excused the violence. Yet even within this suffocating framework, resistance did not disappear. Black communities learned quickly that the battle for freedom would not be fought on a single front. Churches became spaces of quiet planning, schools symbols of defiance, and labor negotiations acts of courage. Veterans who understood structure and discipline recognized that these laws were not random obstacles, but a system meant to be challenged, exposed, and eventually dismantled. Each unjust arrest, each exploitative contract, added to a growing record that revealed the true purpose of the Black Codes to the wider nation. In this way, the attempt to control freedom through law carried the seeds of its own undoing. The contradiction between emancipation and enforced subordination became impossible to ignore. As stories traveled beyond local courts and into national debate, the Black Codes stood as undeniable evidence that the struggle for freedom was far from over, and that without protection. Rights written on paper could be erased as easily as they had been declared. Out of the pressure created by violence in the shadows and restriction in the law emerged a force few had anticipated. Men who had once marched in Union blue, who had learned discipline under fire and survival under command, returned to southern towns no longer willing to be silent witnesses to intimidation. These black veterans carried with them more than memories of war. They carried training, confidence, and a clear understanding that freedom, once claimed, had to be defended. Where the Klan relied on fear and anonymity, these men relied on visibility and resolve. Their presence altered daily life in ways both subtle and profound. In places where nightfall once emptied streets and silenced voices, patrols began to appear, steady and deliberate. Veterans organized local militias, drilling neighbors who had never before held weapons, teaching them not aggression, but coordination and restraint. These groups did not roam in secrecy or disguise. They stood openly at churches, schools, and meeting halls, transforming spaces of vulnerability into spaces of protection. The message was unmistakable. Intimidation would no longer go unanswered. Law enforcement, long used as an instrument of control, also began to change. In towns where black men were appointed as deputies, sheriffs, or police officers, the balance of power shifted in ways that unsettled the old order. Arrests were no longer one-sided. Complaints could be filed without immediate reprisal. For the first time, white citizens who had grown accustomed to acting without consequence found themselves subject to authority that did not automatically yield to status or race. This was not merely symbolic. It disrupted the carefully maintained illusion that violence against black communities was invisible or permissible. The most dangerous duty fell on election days. Voting, already targeted by threats and coercion, became the front line of resistance. Black veterans escorted voters along rural roads and through hostile towns, standing guard at polling places where fear had once decided outcomes. Their calm presence, shaped by battlefield experience, reassured families who understood the risks but refused to abandon their rights. Each successful vote cast under protection represented more than a political act. It was a declaration that citizenship would not be surrendered quietly. Confrontations did occur, and they were not always resolved peacefully. But what distinguished this resistance was its grounding in order rather than chaos. Veterans understood the importance of coordination with federal authorities and sympathetic officials. Reports were filed, testimony gathered, and patterns documented. Violence was no longer isolated rumor. It became evidence. This discipline denied the Klan its greatest advantage, deniability. When intimidation was met with organization, secrecy lost its power. The psychological impact of this shift was immense. The sight of black men in uniform, or carrying out official duties, challenged the core assumptions on which white supremacist ideology depended. Authority, once imagined as exclusively white, now appeared in a form that could not be dismissed or ignored. This presence disrupted not only acts of terror, but the stories used to justify them. Fear began to change direction. Those who had relied on anonymity now faced exposure. Those who had threatened in whispers now hesitated in daylight. Communities responded quickly to this new sense of security. Schools reopened. Meetings resumed. Families traveled more freely, aware that protection, though fragile, was real. The work was exhausting and dangerous, and losses were felt deeply. But the momentum mattered. Every patrol completed without incident, every gathering held without disruption, weakened the narrative that black freedom was temporary or conditional. This chapter of resistance did not promise permanence, and those involved understood that protection could be withdrawn as quickly as it appeared. Yet in that moment, the combination of experience, organization, and courage demonstrated something enduring. Freedom was not defended by hope alone, nor by law in isolation, but by people willing to stand visibly between terror and their communities. Refusing to step aside, the actions of these veterans reshaped the struggle, proving that, even in the face of coordinated intimidation, determination and discipline could force fear to retreat. The momentum built by community defense and organized resistance eventually reached a point where local effort alone was no longer enough. What had begun as scattered acts of protection by black veterans and their allies now demanded something larger, something with the authority to confront terror that had embedded itself into counties, courtrooms, and political offices. The nation could no longer plausibly claim ignorance. Testimonies accumulated. People howled, patterns became undeniable, and the gap between the promise of Reconstruction and the reality on the ground forced a reckoning. Federal intervention emerged not as an abstract policy choice, but as a response to sustained pressure from those who had refused to disappear. When Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, it marked a turning point in how the federal government understood its responsibility. For the first time, the suppression of civil rights through organized intimidation was treated not as a local disturbance, but as a national crisis. The law expanded presidential authority in unprecedented ways, allowing federal power to bypass hostile local systems that had shielded violence behind procedure and delay. It acknowledged a truth that black communities already knew well: where terror ruled, ordinary law could not function. The arrival of federal troops carried both practical and symbolic weight. Integrated units, customs classes, including black soldiers who had already proven their resolve at home, moved into regions where intimidation had long gone unanswered. Their presence changed the rhythm of daily life almost immediately. Roads once dominated by masked riders now echoed with patrols that did not retreat at night. Courthouses that had quietly dismissed complaints now faced scrutiny. The Klan's strength, built on secrecy and assumed immunity, began to fracture under constant exposure. What followed was not chaos, but methodical pressure. Raids were planned carefully, guided by local knowledge and supported by legal authority. Arrests were made openly, often shocking communities accustomed to seeing accusations evaporate. For the first time, individuals who had relied on reputation or intimidation to avoid consequences found themselves called to account. Federal courts, so less entangled in local loyalties, became arenas where testimony mattered and patterns of abuse could be addressed as crimes rather than rumors. The role of black soldiers during this phase cannot be separated from its success. Their participation under federal command amplified a transformation already underway. Where earlier resistance had unsettled the old order, this new alignment confirmed it was not temporary. Black troops standing in uniform, executing lawful orders, and enforcing federal mandates dismantled the ideological foundation of the Klan's message. Authority was no longer a claim rooted in race, but a function of law backed by visible force. The impact was swift and measurable. Networks that had operated with confidence began to collapse as leaders were detained and communication disrupted. Communities that had lived under constant threat experienced a cautious return to public life. Meetings resumed, voter registration increased, and elections passed with far less interference than before. Silence, once imposed by fear, gave way to testimony as people recognized that protection, though not absolute, was real. This success did not mean the disappearance of prejudice or hostility, nor did it erase the losses already endured, but it did dismantle the Klan as an open, coordinated force capable of dictating daily life. The organization retreated from visibility, stripped of its ability to operate openly without consequence. What had seemed invincible proved vulnerable when confronted by sustained federal resolve combined with local courage. For a brief period, the promise of Reconstruction felt tangible, not perfect, not secure, but possible. The combination of federal authority, integrated troops, and community resistance demonstrated that terror could be interrupted, that organized intimidation could be broken when law and will moved together. This moment stood as evidence that freedom, though fragile, could be defended when those entrusted with power chose to act decisively rather than look away. The victories achieved during Reconstruction were real, but they were fragile. They depended on attention, political will, and sustained protection, all of which proved vulnerable to forces far beyond the communities that had fought so hard to defend themselves. When economic crisis struck the nation in the early 1870s, priorities shifted abruptly. Financial collapse in the North consumed headlines, fractured political coalitions, and drained the resolve of leaders who had once promised to safeguard equal rights. Reconstruction, unfinished and contested, slowly slipped from the center of national concern. As federal commitment weakened, so did enforcement. Troops were withdrawn, courts grew hesitant, and the pressure that had once held organized terror at bay began to lift. Former power structures sensed the change immediately. Through legal maneuvering, intimidation, and renewed control of local institutions, many of the gains made by black communities were rolled back step by step. Schools closed, political representation shrank, and the promise of protection faded. What had felt like a new beginning was revealed to be a narrow window, opened briefly and then allowed to close. Yet the collapse of Reconstruction did not erase what had been proven. For a moment in history, terror had been confronted and forced into retreat. Armed black resistance, disciplined and organized, had stood openly against intimidation and survived. Federal authority, when exercised with resolve, had dismantled networks that once seemed untouchable. These were not abstract ideals, but lived realities witnessed by those who had walked guarded streets, cast protected ballots, and rebuilt community life under the watch of men who refused to surrender their rights. That legacy endured even when protection vanished. Stories were carried forward, told quietly in homes, churches, and schools, preserving the memory of a time when fear did not have the final word. These memories mattered because they challenged the narrative of inevitability. They reminded future generations that racial terror was not an unstoppable force of nature, but a system sustained by power and silence, and therefore vulnerable to resistance and exposure. The end of Reconstruction was not the end of the struggle, but it was a lesson written in painful clarity. Progress without protection could be reversed. Rights without enforcement could be stripped away. And yet, courage, once demonstrated, could never be fully erased. The men and women who stood their ground during those years left behind more than institutions. They left behind proof. Proof that collective action could change outcomes. Proof that law, when backed by will, could confront injustice. Proof that even in the darkest moments, resistance could reshape history, if only for a time. Thank you for taking this journey through a chapter of history that deserves to be remembered and understood. If this story deepened your perspective or moved you to reflect on the power of courage and unity, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that stories like this continue to be told, preserved, and passed on.